The reservation was for 8 o'clock at Romano's, that fancy Italian place on 5th Street where my dad used to take us for birthdays when we were kids. I remember standing in front of my bedroom mirror that afternoon, adjusting the burgundy dress I'd bought specifically for tonight. The fabric felt smooth against my skin, and for once, I actually felt beautiful. This was supposed to be our moment, our celebration. Daniel picked me up at 7:30, looking handsome in his navy suit. He seemed nervous, but I figured that was normal. Meeting both families officially as an engaged couple was a big deal. We'd been together for 2 years, and this felt like the real beginning of everything we'd talked about late at night. The wedding, the house, maybe kids someday. All of it felt within reach. The restaurant buzzed with conversation and the gentle clink of silverware against plates. Our families had claimed a large round table near the windows, and I could see my mom had already ordered wine for everyone. She stood up when she saw us, beaming, and pulled me into one of those hugs that makes you feel like you're still 10 years old. My dad shook Daniel's hand with that firm grip he reserved for important occasions, and Daniel's father did the same with me, welcoming me to the family with genuine warmth. Even Daniel's mother, Patricia, seemed to be making an effort. She complimented my dress and asked about work, though I noticed she kept glancing at Daniel throughout our conversation. I'd always felt like she was measuring me somehow, but tonight I pushed those thoughts away. This was about us, about our future, not about whatever complicated relationship he had with his mom. The waiter brought out appetizers, and conversation flowed easily. My Uncle Tony told embarrassing stories about me as a kid, and Daniel's aunt shared photos of him at various family gatherings. I felt myself relaxing, laughing at stories I'd heard before, but somehow felt funnier tonight. This was what I'd always imagined family dinners would be like when I got married. Warm, inclusive, full of love. As the evening progressed, the talk naturally shifted to wedding plans. My mom had already researched venues, and Daniel's father offered to help with the music since he knew a guy who did DJ work. Patricia suggested we have the ceremony at their family church, where Daniel had been baptized. I nodded politely, though we hadn't discussed religion much. These were details we could work out later. I was cutting into my chicken parmesan when I noticed Daniel had barely touched his food. He kept checking his phone and looking around the restaurant like he was searching for someone. When I asked if everything was okay, he just nodded and took a sip of wine. But his hand was shaking slightly, and that nervous energy I'd noticed earlier seemed to be getting worse. The conversation around us continued, but I found myself watching Daniel more closely. He was responding to questions, but his answers felt automatic, like he was reading from a script. When my dad asked about his promotion at work, Daniel gave the same response he'd given at 3 other family gatherings. When his cousin asked about our honeymoon plans, he looked at me blankly, as if he'd forgotten we'd already booked the trip to Ireland. Then dessert arrived. Tiramisu for most of the table, chocolate cake for my dad who never met a dessert he didn't like. The waiter had stuck a small candle in the center of the table, and everyone was laughing at something my brother had said about his own wedding disasters. The mood was light, celebratory, exactly what I'd hoped for. That's when Daniel stood up. Not gradually, not with the casual movement of someone reaching for something. He pushed his chair back abruptly, the legs scraping against the floor loud enough that people at nearby tables turned to look. The conversation at our table stopped mid-sentence. He cleared his throat, and I felt my stomach drop. Something about his posture, the way he was standing so rigidly, told me this wasn't going to be a toast or a thank you speech. This was something else entirely. "You belong to me," he said, his voice carrying across the restaurant. "I only love my mother." The words hung in the air like smoke. I felt my face burn hot, and my hands started trembling. Around the table, forks paused halfway to mouths. My mom's wine glass stopped inches from her lips. Daniel's father looked like he'd been slapped. I forced my mouth into what I hoped looked like a smile and excused myself to the bathroom. My legs felt unsteady as I walked across the restaurant, aware that other diners were watching, whispering. In the mirror, my face looked pale, except for 2 bright red spots on my cheeks. I gripped the sink and tried to breathe normally, but the room felt like it was spinning. When I returned to the table, everyone was making awkward small talk about the weather. Daniel sat down like nothing had happened, and I followed suit, though my hands were still shaking. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced conversation and uncomfortable silences. I don't remember driving home. I went to work the next morning like nothing had happened, put on my gray blazer, grabbed my coffee, and sat through the Monday morning meeting discussing quarterly reports. When my coworker Sarah asked how the dinner went, I heard myself saying, "Great," and the families really hit it off. The words felt foreign in my mouth, like I was speaking someone else's language. Daniel texted me around noon. "Hope you're having a good day. Love you." Just like that. No mention of the night before. No acknowledgement of what had happened in front of both our families. I stared at the message for 10 minutes before typing back, "Love you too," because I didn't know what else to say. My mom called that afternoon. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to her cheerful voice asking if I wanted to grab lunch later in the week to start planning the fun stuff. She sounded normal, happy even. Maybe I had imagined how bad it was. Maybe families have awkward moments all the time and everyone just moves on. But when I got home, Daniel was making dinner like it was any other Tuesday. He kissed my cheek and asked about my day, stirring pasta sauce and humming under his breath. I wanted to ask him what he'd meant, why he'd said those things, but every time I opened my mouth, the words died in my throat. Instead, I set the table and listened to him talk about his project at work. That night, lying in bed, I kept replaying the moment. The way he'd stood up so suddenly, the loudness of his voice, the specific words he'd chosen. "You belong to me. I only love my mother." Not, "I love my mother," or "family is important." He'd said he only loved her, and that I belonged to him, like I was something he owned. I told myself I was overreacting. People say stupid things when they're nervous. Maybe he'd been drinking more than I realized. Maybe the pressure of having both families there had gotten to him. I created a dozen explanations in my head, each one more reasonable than the last. A week passed. Then 2. My brother called to say how nice it was to meet Daniel's family, and I made appropriate responses. Daniel's aunt sent me a Facebook friend request with a message about how excited she was for the wedding. I accepted it and typed back about how we were still figuring out dates. But something had shifted between Daniel and me. Something I couldn't quite name. I started noticing things I'd dismissed before. The way he always called his mother before making any decision. Even small ones like what to have for dinner. How he'd text her goodnight every single night, but rarely said it to me unless I said it first. The way he'd interrupt conversations with friends to answer her calls immediately. I began watching their interactions more carefully. When we had dinner at his parents' house on Sundays, he'd sit next to her, and they'd have entire conversations that felt like they were speaking in code. Inside jokes, shared references, a way of communicating that didn't include anyone else. I'd sit there picking at my food, feeling like an outsider in what was supposed to be my future family. One evening, about 3 weeks after the restaurant incident, Daniel brought me flowers. Bright yellow tulips, my favorite. For a moment, standing in our doorway with that bouquet, he looked like the man I'd fallen in love with. The one who remembered little details about me, who made me laugh until my sides hurt. "I'm sorry about that night," he said, not meeting my eyes. I was overwhelmed. You know how I get with big family things. I wanted to feel relieved. I wanted to hug him and tell him it was okay, that we all say things we don't mean sometimes. But the apology felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced it in his car, and he still hadn't explained what he'd actually meant. "What did you mean when you said I belong to you?" I asked. He looked genuinely confused. "I don't really remember saying that. I just remember feeling anxious and saying something stupid. Can we just forget about it?" But I couldn't forget about it. Every time he touched me, every time we lay in bed together, those words echoed in my mind. I started pulling away from him physically, making excuses about being tired or stressed at work. He didn't seem to notice. Or if he did, he didn't mention it. I began keeping a mental list of things that bothered me. The way he'd ask his mother's opinion about my haircut. How he'd tell her details about our relationship that felt private. The way he'd defend her automatically, even when she made comments that clearly bothered me. 2 months after the dinner, I realized I was living with a stranger. Someone who looked like the man I'd agreed to marry, but acted like someone I'd never met. I'd stopped sharing things with him, stopped looking forward to coming home, stopped planning our future in my head. I was just going through the motions, pretending everything was normal while something inside me slowly died. The worst part was how easily he seemed to accept my distance. He didn't ask why I was quiet during dinner, or why I'd stopped reaching for his hand while we watched TV. He just adapted to my new boundaries like they were natural, like maybe this was what engagement was supposed to feel like. I started staying late at work, taking longer routes home, finding excuses to visit friends on weekends. Anything to avoid being alone with him, because being alone meant having to acknowledge what was really happening between us. And I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. I started waking up at 5:30 every morning, a full hour before my alarm, not because I wanted to, but because my body had apparently decided that sleep was no longer an option. I'd lie there in the dark, listening to Daniel breathe beside me, feeling like a stranger in my own bed. The early mornings became my sanctuary. I'd make coffee and sit on our small balcony, watching the city wake up below. The quiet felt healing somehow, like I was remembering how to be alone with my thoughts. I'd started bringing a notebook out there, not to write anything specific, just to have something to do with my hands, while I tried to figure out what was happening to my life. Daniel never questioned my new routine. He'd find me there when he got up for work, kiss the top of my head, and make some comment about me being an early bird. It was easier to let him think I was just going through a phase than to explain that I couldn't stand lying next to him anymore. Work became my refuge. I volunteered for every extra project, stayed late for meetings that probably didn't need my input, and found myself actually enjoying the subway ride home because it delayed having to walk through our front door. My coworkers started commenting on my dedication, and I let them think I was just ambitious rather than running away from my own life. The physical distance between Daniel and me had become a chasm. I'd moved to the far side of the bed, claiming I was hot at night. When he'd try to pull me closer, I'd make excuses about being uncomfortable or needing space to sleep. He'd accepted this new arrangement with the same casual indifference he'd shown about everything else. I stopped initiating any kind of physical contact. No more reaching for his hand while we watched TV. No more casual touches while we cooked dinner together. I was testing something, I realized. I wanted to see if he'd notice, if he'd ask what was wrong, if he'd fight for the intimacy we'd once shared so easily. He didn't notice. Or if he did, he didn't care enough to say anything. One evening in early April, I was grading papers at the kitchen table when he brought me flowers again. Different ones this time. Pink roses from the grocery store. They were pretty enough, but something about the gesture felt hollow. I thanked him and put them in water, but I caught myself looking at the card he'd attached. From Daniel and Mom, it read in his familiar handwriting. I stood there holding the card, reading those 4 words over and over. Not from Daniel or love Daniel, from both of them, like they were a unit, and I was the recipient of their joint thoughtfulness, like she'd been part of the decision to buy me flowers, maybe even suggested it. "Your mom helped pick these out?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "She mentioned that women like flowers when they're stressed," he said, not looking up from his laptop. "She's good at that kind of thing." I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask him why he needed his mother's advice to buy his fiancé flowers, why he couldn't recognize when I was struggling without her input, why everything in our relationship somehow involved her opinion. Instead, I just nodded and went back to my papers. That night, I heard him on the phone with her after he thought I'd gone to sleep. Their conversation was quiet, but I could make out enough to understand they were talking about me, about how I'd been distant lately, and maybe going through something. I heard him mention my menstrual cycle, discussing it with his mother like it was relevant information she needed to have. I lay there in the dark, feeling violated in a way I couldn't fully articulate. This was my body, my emotional state, my private struggles, and he was sharing them with her like she was entitled to know, like I was a problem they needed to solve together. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I couldn't face another day of pretending everything was normal. Instead, I drove to the lake outside town, a place I used to go in college when I needed to think. I sat on a bench and watched families feeding ducks, couples walking hand in hand, people living their lives while mine felt like it was falling apart. I tried to remember when I'd first noticed the dynamic between Daniel and his mother. Had it always been this intense, or had I just been too infatuated to see it clearly? I thought about our early dates, How he'd always check in with her about our plans. How she'd call during dinner and he'd always answer. How she'd give me advice about him, like she was letting me in on secrets about her son. At the time, I thought it was sweet. A close family. A man who respected his mother's opinion. Now I wondered if I'd been incredibly naive. I started thinking about my own parents. How they'd raised me to be independent, to make my own decisions, to value my own judgment. They'd been supportive when I'd told them about Daniel, but they'd never tried to insert themselves into our relationship. They trusted me to figure things out on my own. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Daniel had never learned to separate himself from his mother. And maybe more importantly, she'd never let him. They were enmeshed in a way that left no room for anyone else, especially not a wife. I drove home that afternoon with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I needed to have a real conversation with Daniel, not the surface-level discussions we'd been having. I needed to understand what kind of marriage he was envisioning, what role his mother would play in our life together, and whether there was actually space for me in their relationship. But when I walked through the door, I found him rearranging the living room furniture, not just moving things around, but completely changing the layout. The couch was against a different wall, the coffee table had been moved, and he'd rearranged all the books on the shelves. "What's going on?" I asked, setting down my purse. "Mom had some ideas about the flow of the room," he said, stepping back to admire his work. "She thinks it'll be better for entertaining." I stood there looking at my living room, transformed according to his mother's vision, and felt something inside me break. This was my home, my space, my life, and somehow it had become subject to her approval and redesign. I was disappearing, bit by bit, and he was helping it happen. Sunday mornings used to be my favorite time of the week. Daniel would make pancakes while I read the paper, and we'd spend hours in bed talking about nothing important. But that particular Sunday in May, I woke up to the sound of voices in the living room. Female voices. Plural. I threw on my robe and walked out to find Patricia directing two women I didn't recognize as they moved our furniture around. Again, the couch was being pushed against the opposite wall, and someone was hanging new curtains I'd never seen before. "Good morning, sweetheart," Patricia said when she saw me, not pausing in her instructions to the women. "We're just making a few improvements." Daniel let us in. I looked around for Daniel and found him in the kitchen, making coffee for everyone like this was perfectly normal. Like I hadn't explicitly told him 2 weeks ago that I didn't want his mother rearranging our living space anymore. "What's happening?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Mom thought the room needed better flow," Daniel said, handing Patricia a mug. "She brought some decorators to help. Professional decorators. In my home, on a Sunday morning, without asking me. I watched them work for a few minutes, these strangers handling my things, deciding where my books should go, what photos deserved wall space. Patricia was explaining the vision she had for the space, how it would be more welcoming for family gatherings and easier to entertain in. "This is our home," I said quietly to Daniel when Patricia was distracted. "I know," he replied. "That's why Mom wants it to be perfect." That word hit me like a physical blow. Perfect. According to whose standards? And why was his mother the one defining what perfect meant in the space where I lived? I went back to the bedroom and stayed there until the voices stopped. When I emerged an hour later, the living room looked like a showroom. Everything was arranged in precise angles, the colors coordinated, the personal touches we'd accumulated over 2 years either removed or repositioned to fit someone else's aesthetic. "What do you think?" Patricia asked, standing in the center of the room with obvious pride. "It's very nice," I managed, though the words felt like glass in my throat. "Good," she said, gathering her purse. "Now it feels like a real home." After she left, I sat on the newly positioned couch and tried to recognize my own living space. The painting I'd bought at a local art fair was gone, replaced by something more sophisticated. The bookshelf was organized by color instead of by author, making it impossible to find anything. Even the throw pillows were different, matching the new curtains perfectly. Daniel seemed pleased with the transformation. He kept walking around, admiring different angles, commenting on how open everything felt now. I wanted to ask him if he noticed that nothing of me remained in the room, but I was afraid of his answer. That evening, After we'd eaten dinner in silence, I decided to try one more time to reach him. I waited until he was relaxed, watching TV on the repositioned couch, and then I sat down next to him. "Daniel," I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." He muted the TV and turned to face me, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the man I'd fallen in love with, the one who used to listen when I talked, who cared about my feelings. "Do you love me?" I asked. The question seemed to surprise him. "Of course I do." "Why would you ask that?" "Because sometimes I feel like I'm not important to you, like your mother's opinion matters more than mine." He was quiet for a long moment, and I felt a spark of hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe we could finally have the conversation we'd been avoiding. "I love you," he said finally. "But my mother is the most important woman in my life. That's just how I was raised." The hope died as quickly as it had appeared. "More important than your fiancé?" I asked. "Not more important, just different." He seemed to think this distinction mattered. "You're the woman I'm going to marry. She's the woman who raised me. They're different kinds of love." I took a breath and tried again. "But what about when we're married? What about when we have our own family?" "She'll always be my mother," he said, like I was asking him to change the weather. "That doesn't change just because we get married." I felt something shift inside me. A door closing that I hadn't even realized was still open. "So, if she disagreed with something I wanted for our family, whose side would you take?" He looked uncomfortable now, like I was asking unfair questions. "It wouldn't come to that. Mom wants what's best for me, for us. But what if it did come to that? What if you had to choose?" The silence stretched between us, and I realized I had my answer. He couldn't even imagine a scenario where he'd choose me over her. It wasn't that he wouldn't. It was that the possibility had never occurred to him. "I don't like these hypothetical questions," he said, reaching for the remote. "They're not helpful." That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Daniel slept peacefully beside me. I thought about the woman I'd been 2 years ago, before I'd met him. She'd been confident, independent, sure of her own worth. She'd had opinions about furniture and decorating and how she wanted to live her life. I tried to remember the last time I'd made a decision without considering his mother's potential reaction. The last time I'd felt like my own person instead of an accessory to their relationship. The last time I'd felt at home in my own home. I couldn't remember. The next morning, I called my sister Emma while Daniel was at work. I hadn't talked to her in weeks, partly because I'd been avoiding everyone, but mostly because I was ashamed. Ashamed of what I'd allowed my life to become. Ashamed of how small I'd made myself. "I need to stay with you for a few days," I said when she answered. "Of course," she said immediately. "What's wrong?" "I think I'm losing myself," I admitted, and started crying for the first time since that dinner at Romano's. "Come over now," Emma said. "We'll figure this out together." I packed a small suitcase while Daniel was at work, taking only what I needed for a few days. I left a note saying I needed some space to think. Nothing dramatic or final. I just needed to breathe air that didn't feel heavy with someone else's expectations. Driving to Emma's house, I felt lighter than I had in months. For the first time in forever, I was making a decision based entirely on what I needed, not on what anyone else wanted or expected. It was such a foreign feeling that I almost turned around twice. But I kept driving toward my sister's house, toward a place where I could remember who I used to be. Emma's guest room had white walls and a single bed with a patchwork quilt our grandmother had made. After months of living in spaces that felt designed by committee, the simplicity was almost overwhelming. I sat on the edge of the bed that first night and cried until I had no tears left. "Tell me everything," Emma said, bringing me tea in a mug that said, "World's okayest sister." It was a joke gift I'd given her years ago, but seeing it now made me smile for the first time in weeks. So I told her everything, starting with the dinner at Romano's and ending with the redecorated living room. I told her about the flowers signed by both of them, about the phone calls where Daniel discussed my personal life with his mother, about the way I'd started feeling like a guest in my own home. Emma listened without interrupting, but I could see her getting angrier as the story went on. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "I should have said something sooner," she said finally. "I could see you disappearing, but you seemed so happy at first. I thought maybe I was imagining things. I was happy, I said. Or I thought I was. I think I was in love with the idea of being in love. And now? Now I feel like I've been sleepwalking for 2 years. We stayed up until 3 a.m, talking about everything I'd been keeping bottled up. Emma helped me see patterns I'd been too close to notice, how I'd gradually stopped mentioning my own preferences, how I'd started asking Daniel's opinion about everything, even things that had nothing to do with him, how I'd begun to see myself through his mother's eyes instead of my own. You know what's crazy? I said, as we were finally getting ready for bed. I don't even know what I like anymore, what kind of furniture I want, what colors make me happy, what I want to do with my weekends. I've been so focused on fitting into their vision of what I should be that I forgot who I actually am. So let's figure it out, Emma said. You're staying here until you remember. The next morning, I called in sick to work again. I needed another day to think, to plan, to figure out what came next. Emma made pancakes, and we sat at her kitchen table making lists like we used to do when we were kids trying to solve our problems. List 1. Things I used to love that I'd stopped doing. Reading mystery novels, painting watercolors, taking long walks without a destination, trying new restaurants, going to concerts alone when I couldn't find anyone to go with me. List 2. Things I'd started doing only because Daniel or his mother expected them. Cooking elaborate Sunday dinners, attending his mother's book club, buying clothes in colors that photographed well for family events, always being available for last-minute plans. List 3. Things I wanted to do, but had been afraid to suggest. Travel somewhere neither of them had been. Take a pottery class. Cut my hair short. Paint my bedroom walls a color other than beige. Looking at those lists, I realized how much of myself I'd negotiated away. Not all at once, but gradually, decision by decision, until I'd become someone I barely recognized. I need to end this, I said to Emma. Not just take a break or work things out. I need to end it completely. Are you sure? She asked. Because if you are, I'll help you with whatever you need. I thought about Daniel waking up in our apartment, probably wondering where I was, but not enough to actually call. I thought about Patricia, who would probably see my absence as temporary inconvenience rather than a sign of serious problems. I thought about the woman I'd been before I'd met them, and the woman I could become again. I'm sure, I said. Emma helped me research lawyers who specialized in lease agreements and property division. I didn't have much in the way of shared assets, but I wanted to handle everything properly. I also looked into therapists, knowing I'd need help understanding how I'd lost myself so completely. The hardest part was writing a letter to my parents. They'd grown to love Daniel, and I knew they'd be disappointed. But I also knew they'd be more disappointed if I stayed in a relationship that was slowly erasing me. I wrote draft after draft, trying to explain without sounding like I was making excuses. Finally, I settled on honesty. I told them about the dinner, about the pattern of behavior I'd been ignoring, about the way I'd felt like a stranger in my own life. I told them I loved them, and that I hoped they'd understand that leaving wasn't about giving up, but about finding myself again. Emma read it over and suggested I add more about what I'd learned about myself, not just what had gone wrong. So I wrote about wanting to be in a relationship where I could be myself completely, where my opinions mattered, where I was seen as an equal partner rather than an accessory to someone else's life. I sealed the letter and left it on Emma's kitchen counter, planning to mail it the next day. That evening, my phone rang. Daniel. I'd been expecting his call, but still felt my heart rate spike when I saw his name on the screen. Hey, I said, trying to sound normal. Where are you? He asked. I came home and found your note. I'm at Emma's. I told you I needed some space. But why? Did something happen at work? Are you sick? The fact that he couldn't connect my absence to our conversation about his mother, to the redecorated living room, to months of growing distance between us, told me everything I needed to know. I'm not sick, I said. I just need time to think. Think about what? If this is about the furniture thing, Mom was just trying to help. It's not about the furniture, Daniel. It's about us. There was a pause, and I could almost hear him trying to process what I meant. Well, when are you coming home? He asked. I don't know, I said honestly. Maybe I'm not. Another pause, longer this time. We should talk about this in person, he said finally. Can I come over? Not tonight, I said. I'm not ready yet. After I hung up, Emma and I sat on her couch, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not happiness exactly, but a kind of calm that came from finally being honest about what I wanted. How do you feel? Emma asked. Scared, I admitted, but also relieved, like I can finally breathe again. That's how you know you're making the right choice, she said. I spent the next few days at Emma's, gradually remembering who I was when I wasn't trying to be what someone else wanted. I read books I'd been meaning to get to for months. I took long baths without worrying about taking too long. I ate cereal for dinner because I wanted to, not because I had to plan a proper meal. Small things, but they felt revolutionary after so long of living according to someone else's schedule and preferences. By the end of the week, I knew I was ready to go back to the apartment. Not to stay, but to have the conversation I'd been avoiding for months. To return the ring and close this chapter of my life properly. It was time to stop running from the truth and start walking toward it instead. I stood outside our apartment building for 15 minutes before I finally used my key. The lobby smelled like coffee and cleaning products. Familiar scents that should have felt like coming home, but instead felt like visiting a place I used to know well. Daniel was waiting in the living room, still arranged according to his mother's vision. He looked tired, older somehow, like the past week had aged him more than the previous month. When he saw me, he stood up quickly, and I could see hope in his eyes that made what I had to do even harder. I'm glad you came back, he said, reaching for me. I stepped back, not cruelly, but definitively. I'm not back, Daniel. I'm here to get my things. The hope died in his face, replaced by confusion. What do you mean? I pulled the engagement ring from my pocket and held it out to him. The diamond caught the afternoon light streaming through the new curtains, and for a moment, it looked like the promise it was supposed to represent. But promises only work when both people understand what they're agreeing to. I can't marry you, I said simply. He stared at the ring but didn't take it. Is this about the furniture? Because we can change it back. Mom won't mind. It's not about the furniture, I said, though hearing him automatically speak for his mother proved my point better than any argument I could have made. It's about us, about who we are together. I sat down on the couch, and after a moment, he joined me. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of 2 years settling between us. I don't understand, he said finally. I thought we were happy. You were happy, I corrected. I was disappearing. I tried to explain it to him. How I'd gradually stopped having opinions about things that mattered to me. How I'd started seeing myself through his mother's eyes instead of my own. How I'd felt like a guest in my own life, always trying to earn approval, never quite measuring up to some standard I didn't understand. But Mom likes you, he said, genuinely confused. She's always saying nice things about you. She likes the version of me that agrees with her, I said. The one who doesn't rock the boat. But that's not who I really am. I told him about the lists I'd made at Emma's house, about remembering all the things I'd loved that I'd gradually given up. I told him about the morning I'd realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd made a decision without considering his mother's potential reaction. I've been trying so hard to be what you both wanted that I forgot who I actually am, I said. And I don't think you ever really wanted to know who that was. Daniel was quiet for a long time, turning the ring over in his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was small. I do love you, he said. I know you do, I replied. But you love your mother more. And that's okay, but it's not enough for me. It doesn't have to be a competition, he said. You're right, it doesn't. But that's not how you've been treating it. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city I'd been hiding from for months. When you said I belonged to you that night at dinner, maybe you really meant it. But belonging isn't ownership, Daniel. It's connection. It's choice. It's two people deciding they want to build something together. I want to build something with you, he said. No, you want me to fit into something you've already built with your mother. There's a difference. I started gathering my things while he sat on the couch, looking lost. I didn't have much to take. Most of our shared possessions were more his than mine anyway, or things I'd chosen to please him, rather than because I actually wanted them. What about the wedding? he asked as I packed books into a box. What about it? People will ask questions. They'll want to know why. I paused in my packing. Tell them the truth, that we weren't compatible, that we wanted different things. But what will I tell my family? My mother. Even now, faced with the end of our relationship, his first concern was how to explain it to her. I felt sad for him, but also relieved that I was finally seeing clearly. Tell them whatever you think is best, I said. That's not my responsibility anymore. As I packed, I found myself remembering good times we'd had together. The way he'd made me laugh when we first met. The trips we'd taken before his mother's opinions became the silent third party in our relationship. The man I'd fallen in love with had been real, but he'd been buried under expectations and obligations he'd never questioned. I don't know how to be without you, he said suddenly. You'll figure it out, I said. Just like I'm figuring out how to be myself again. I finished packing and called Emma to come help me load everything into her car. While we waited for her, Daniel and I sat in the redesigned living room one last time. Do you think we could try again someday? He asked. After you've had time to think? I don't think so, I said gently. I think you need to figure out who you are when you're not trying to be the son your mother wants. And I need to remember who I am when I'm not trying to be what someone else wants. But what if we both figure those things out? Then we'll be different people, I said. And maybe those people won't be right for each other either. Emma arrived with her car, and we loaded my boxes in silence. Daniel helped carry things down, and I appreciated that he didn't make it harder than it already was. At the door, I hugged him goodbye. It felt like closing a book I'd been reading for 2 years, one that had started as a love story, but had gradually become something else entirely. Take care of yourself, I said. You too, he replied. 6 months later, I'm writing this from my small studio apartment across town. The walls are pale green, a color I chose because it makes me happy. I have plants on every windowsill and books stacked in corners because I ran out of shelf space. My furniture doesn't match, but it's all mine, chosen because I liked it, not because it photographed well or impressed anyone. I started therapy and learned that losing yourself in a relationship is more common than I'd thought. I learned about boundaries and self-worth, and the difference between compromise and self-erasure. I learned that love shouldn't require you to become smaller. I also learned that I'm stronger than I thought, that I can make decisions and live with the consequences, that I can be alone without being lonely, that I can trust my own judgment about what's right for my life. My parents understood, eventually. They were disappointed about the wedding, but they were more concerned about my happiness than their expectations. They told me they'd noticed I'd seemed different in recent months, quieter, less like myself. They wished I'd talked to them sooner. I've started painting again, watercolors mostly, nothing fancy. I bought a bike and explored different neighborhoods on weekends. I joined a book club where people actually want to hear my opinions. I'm dating someone new, slowly, carefully, making sure I don't lose myself again. Daniel texted me once, about a month after I moved out. He said he missed me and asked if I was happy. I told him I was learning to be. He didn't respond, and I was glad. We'd said everything we needed to say. Sometimes I think about that night at Romano's, about the words that started my journey back to myself. You belong to me. I only love my mother. At the time, they felt like a judgment, a dismissal of my worth. Now I understand them as a gift, a moment of honesty that freed me from a life that was slowly suffocating me. I belong to no one but myself, and in that belonging, I've found a kind of love that's bigger and more sustaining than anything I thought I wanted. It's the love of knowing who you are and refusing to apologize for it. It's the love of choosing yourself, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. I'm learning that belonging isn't about fitting into someone else's vision of what your life should look like. It's about creating a life that feels authentic to who you are, and then inviting people to join you there. Not to change you, but to celebrate you. Not to complete you, but to complement you. I'm still figuring out what that looks like, but I'm not afraid of the process anymore. I have time, I have space, and I have myself. For now, that's enough.